Everyone. Thanks for having me. So Clarissa invited me to come and talk about the capital improvement program tonight. So let me just get my slideshow started. And there we go. Can everybody see my slides okay? All right. So yeah, I'll just jump right in. I'm Kristen Ahearn. I'm the Capital Improvement Program Planner for the City of Baltimore. Baltimore is a little bit unique in that the capital budget responsibility falls to the Department of Planning rather than the Department of Finance. So I'm here tonight to tell you about the Capital Improvement Program and how you can get involved and answer your questions. First, just a kind of big picture, the budget is composed of the operating and capital budget. You guys probably heard a little bit about the difference between the two last week. The operating budget is kind of far and away the larger budget of the city and what people tend to focus on and cover sort of the day-to-day business of the city, whereas the capital budget is really for the physical infrastructure of the city. And so I won't read you all this list of types of capital projects, but again, it's really the bricks and mortar projects for the most part, like roads, bridges, bike lanes, sidewalks. Lately, it has included more major software systems. So that's fairly new that's becoming an increasingly large part of the capital budget. We also fund some contributions to cultural attractions like the Great Blacks and Wax Museum, the National Aquarium, schools, libraries, fire stations, rec centers, water, sewer infrastructure. And then we also have some kind of more community and economic development focused activities in the capital budget, like demolition, housing redevelopment, and economic development incentives. So we wanted to kind of pause here before I really get into the meat of what the capital improvement program is and do a little bit of an interactive activity. So we're giving each of you, Clarissa's going to put a link in the chat if she hasn't already to a survey. And basically we're giving you $80 million. You become the capital budget planner for the city and we're asking you to allocate your 80 million. You have 8 clicks, I think, and you can allocate them across 10 different categories. And I think you can do 2 per category or 3 or 4. So you can put $40 million towards one thing and $10 million towards 4 other things. But your choices are somewhat representative of the choices that we have to make every year when we put together the capital budget. So affordable housing, 10 million would get you a contribution to a large scale affordable housing development. Probably would leverage some other funds, some state and federal, maybe certainly private funds as well. Demolition, rec center transformations, park upgrades, libraries. Are you all able to get into the survey and start making choices? Clarissa, if you're able to see, I'll just give you all a minute to make your choices and allocate your budget. And then Clarissa, maybe you can let me know when there's a couple of responses in there and I'll stop sharing my screen and go over to the survey so that we can all look at the results together.
Yeah, sounds good. And for anyone who's missing it in the chat, the link is just bit.ly/C, I, P presentation. CIP presentation.
And you can kind of think a little bit too about what you might get for 10 million in each of these categories. So a library renovation, you might actually be able to renovate 2 library branches for that amount of money. Police and fire station upgrades. Fire stations, typically we're doing things like new roofs or locker rooms for female officers or fire systems or windows, that type of thing. So we can do quite a few for 10 million. Street resurfacing, obviously you get fewer street miles to resurface than you would for bike lanes or sidewalks. 10 million would be a lot for homeowner and business incentives. You could kind of reach a lot of homeowners or businesses that way.
I have a question. I mean, this is just for fun, but like, are the numbers 1 through 8 indicative of like 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, or is that in order of preference? Because it won't let you pick more than one per column.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't totally sure how to set this up, but basically for each number, that's just like your first 10 million and then your second 10 million, third 10 million, etc. And you should just click like where you want to allocate each of those 10 million, and there's 8 of them, if that makes sense. So each column should have one selection.
Got you, thanks.
So essentially, if you wanted to put 30 million in affordable housing, you'd click 1, 2, and 3. Is that?
Yep.
We usually, when we're in person, we have buckets and we have actual coins that you can like throw in the buckets to allocate your money. So thank you, Clarissa, for helping us figure out how to do this on a Google form. I actually had not thought to do it this way, so I love it. How many responses do we have?
I have about 6 responses right now.
Okay.
We have a clear winner for where to invest money at the moment.
Will it surprise me?
I don't know, maybe.
I'm certainly expecting a lot in sidewalks and bike lanes. All right, I'm gonna flip over to the survey and see if I can look at the results.
Yeah.
New share.
Cool, we have 9 responses right now. Maybe a 10th person wants to send theirs in.
All right, so I'll share, hopefully everyone can see the results. It's a little tough to figure out how to interpret this. Well, maybe I'll try to put it into a better chart for you and send it back out after the presentation, but we can kind of get a sense for.
Yeah, I think basically the more color there is.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, the more people voted for that one.
Mm-hmm. So affordable housing as the first choice certainly stands out. Not a lot of demolition. Interesting. Rec centers are usually pretty popular, so, but maybe not one of the more popular here. Not a lot of love for libraries. Police and fire stations are never very popular, but unfortunately we're doing work that is just kind of basic and necessary. Street resurfacing, maybe more than I would have expected, but that actually usually is pretty popular in this game. A lot of sidewalks and bike lanes. Incentives, not as much, and school buildings. Interesting. Yeah, well, thank you so much for doing that. Let me switch back to my PowerPoint now. Yeah, so thank you everybody for participating in that. Like I said, it actually is somewhat indicative of the types of decisions that we have to make every year through the capital budget, where I'm sure, as you know, there's limited funding and we have to kind of evaluate all these vast needs that the city has and allocate money in the way we think is best. So really basic. City charter gives the planning department the responsibility to prepare and recommend a 6-year capital improvement program to the Board of Estimates. And the first year of that 6-year program or plan that we put together becomes the budget. That money gets put into accounts at city agencies and agencies spend on those projects. The outer years are really just a guide. And so we actually start the 6-year cycle each year. So each year we do a 6-year program. For example, last year we did the FY21 to 26 program. 21 became the budget that year. The other years act as a guide. So what we said we were going to do in FY22 in last year's program kind of gives us a template to start from when we put together this year's program. And that's sort of how it works. So it's on a rolling basis. Each year we do a new program and the first year becomes the budget. And I think I'll kind of go back to that because that does sort of affect how you might choose to do some advocacy if you do want to get involved. Board of Estimates sets a policy for what a capital improvement is, and they've said that it's a physical betterment or improvement and any preliminary studies relative thereto. It's not anything costing less than $50,000. It's not vehicles. It's not equipment or supplies. It shouldn't be repairs or maintenance that's less than 100,000 or an emergency, and it should not be salaries. So we'll spend a little bit of time here at the process. I think some of you are probably somewhat familiar with this, but we started back in September, October, and we basically gave agencies instructions and likely funding levels. So we give agencies a range of about how much funding they can expect. We'll say, you know, between 10 and 15 million for Parks and Rec, for example. And they go back and they formulate projects and they request up to $15 million for specific projects. And so they make those requests and submit them in December. We usually publish those requests on our website toward the end of the month. And then we meet with the agencies basically now through February to understand and review the projects that they've submitted. In January, mid-January, the agencies come and present the projects that they've requested and present their priorities to the Planning Commission. And those are public events. We live stream them. We invite people to watch and attend in person when we're able to be in person and make comments as time permits. Those are actually a really good way. It's a long day. There's 8 presentations. They can be a little boring, but they're also can be really fascinating. You really get to see how an agency works and why they're prioritizing things the way they are. So invite you to attend those. I think they're fantastic. And specifically, you know, for the items that you're more interested in. Basically, so that's 2 marathon days when agencies present to the Planning Commission. And then in late February, planning staff, which is, me and my boss and other people who've worked on the CIP, we present recommendations to the Planning Commission for which projects to fund. So the top end of the range that we give agencies always exceeds what we know we're going to be able to fund. And there's a couple of reasons we do that. To make it a competitive process. Also really to put more needs on the record. We know that agencies are responsible for assets that need a lot of work, and there are a lot of good projects that we could do to move the city forward toward, the goals we've set. So we allow agencies to put those on the record, and then as decisions are being made on the operating side, they can kind of see what they would get if they were able to find additional funding for capital. So in February, we come back and we make recommendations about which to fund, given the levels of funding that we've been told we have for capital. And then in early March, the Planning Commission comes back and votes on a set of recommendations. From there, the 6-year program, the recommendations go through a more formal approval process. And that's the Planning Commission vote, the Board of Finance votes. They're mostly just making sure we're staying within the right funding levels. The Board of Estimates votes, and then the first year gets kind of paired with the operating budget and goes to City Council as the ordinance of estimates. Typically, we don't see a lot change between when Planning Commission votes and when City Council votes. There may be a few things here and there, like a state grant that we didn't know we were getting that we now know we're getting that we'll put in. But usually, you know, priorities aren't changing at that point. City Council not starting with this year's budget, not starting with FY22, but I believe the next round of budget, they'll have the ability to shift things in the budget. So we don't know exactly what that will mean for the capital budget, but it's possible that it might change a little more than it has so far. And so these are all formal approval processes and public meetings at which you are able to come and testify publicly. And it's certainly meaningful to come and express your priorities and kind of let these decision makers know what you prioritize. It usually doesn't change things too much for the current year, but it I think is still pretty worthwhile because it may affect how future years are shaped. And so Clarissa and Jed asked me to really focus on the best ways to get involved. So I just wanted to tell you kind of what I've seen. I've been doing this for about 4 years, and so what I've seen that works and what some of the more successful advocacy efforts have looked like. And so we tell people, you know, get involved in agency plans, submit 311 requests to let agencies know about infrastructure that's not working. And every project starts from a request that an agency makes. So that's why we say to work directly with an agency to advocate for a specific project. As a resident, before I worked for the city, I probably wouldn't have known how to get in touch with an agency to start to advocate. So, you know, I'll put out an offer that I'm happy to act as that conduit. Although I know that, you know, you all have pretty deep relationships through Baltimore with DOT and probably other city agencies too. So that would be another good way to get connected. The Planning Commission presentations, I'd really encourage you all to attend. The planning commissioners do listen to what people say there, and they provide feedback to the agencies and think about it when they're listening to our recommendations and staff, and they'll tweak things based on what they've heard. We've seen that happen. So would certainly encourage you to attend those. And then the briefing session in late February is also a public meeting. Those dates are listed on our website. And I'm sure they'll all be virtual this year, so the WebEx link is also accessible through our website. And then you can also communicate support by sending a letter to Planning Commission, care of the planning director. So those are kind of the best ways to get involved. And then I'll just say, what I've seen be successful is when the advocacy kind of includes support of multiple neighborhoods and community leaders. We've seen groups work through council people or work with council people to advance a project. We've seen groups write letters to the Planning Commission and copy their council people and delegates. And so those are some of the ways that people approach that kind of advocacy. And were there any questions in the chat about any of that?
Not yet.
Okay.
But yeah, feel free to put in some questions if anyone has any.
That's sort of the end of my how to get involved spiel. So, but we can come back to that in the Q&A too if people have other questions. So as we're making our recommendations, I just want to touch on how that happens. I've listed on the screen the current Planning Commission evaluation criteria. And these are things like protecting public health and safety, leveraging other fund sources, if a capital investment results in an operating savings, state and federal mandates, priority housing or economic development projects, public-private partnerships, implements a city plan, implements the sustainability plan, an agency has prioritized the project and promotes equity. And so this final criteria around equity, we started looking at in 2018, and we're still kind of defining it better. So I'm going to talk about that a little more at the end of the presentation. And then also just a little teaser that we're kind of broadly looking at these criteria right now with the hopes of maybe updating them in the next couple of years. And so we'll certainly have a public process around that at some point when we're ready. Just to go over how the funding breaks down. So we'll take the current fiscal year as an example. DPW, the utilities, the water, sewer, and stormwater utilities are all included in the capital budget. Those are all funded entirely by water and sewer bills. So it's a bit of a separate process. It does represent about 3/4 of the capital budget, but that money could not be used for other priorities, and other funding, general funds, would not be used for the utilities. So it's kind of separated. Otherwise, transportation is the next largest piece of the pie, and that reflects a lot of federal funding that DOT gets for capital projects, as well as the conduit utility that they operate under that agency. So, you know, there are conduits that run beneath the city, and a lot of telecom companies rent them to run their wires. And so DOT runs a utility related to that. And then HCD also has a fairly big slice of the pie, again, representing some state and federal dollars that they get. And then you have Rec and Parks, Department of General Services, IT, schools get 19 million a year, but that matches state funding that does not go through the city's budget. So their capital budget is larger than this, but this is the city's contribution. And then planning, the mayor's office, and solid waste get fairly small allocations. The capital budget, we have several different fund sources that go into the capital budget. Revenue loans, utility funds, and county grants all represent that 3/4 of the pie that DPW utilities make up. So those are specific fund sources for the utilities. But then we also have state and federal funds. We have other funds. The conduit utility would be represented in that other, and then perhaps some private fees or fees or private payments and things like that. And then these last 4 or 5, I guess, even though one is 0, down here are what we call the general fund backed sources. I think I have a slide with that. So these are all sources that are supported by the city's general fund, which is what you really probably focused on last week in the operating budget presentation. And so they're a combination of debt sources and then current revenues that go toward capital. So first you have general obligation bonds. That's 80 million a year in debt that we take out to pay for capital projects. And the reason for that, it's common practice across cities nationwide. And the reason that we use debt to finance a lot of these projects is because the projects are generally expected to last 30 to 50 to 100 years. So we pay for them over 20 to 30 years through that debt source. General funds, HUR, or city general funds are just, you know, current revenues budgeted in the operating budget that go towards a capital project. So we had 500,000, all these amounts are in thousands. We had 500,000 last year. HUR, I hope you kind of got the background on how HUR is budgeted in the city. It's highway user revenue. The city puts the highway user revenue that we get from the state directly into the general fund, and then we just sort of account for it separately on the back end. So there were no general funds budgeted last year, so no HUR. And then transportation revenue bonds. This is 15 million in debt that we take out. The debt is issued by the state, and it's paid back through future highway user revenue that comes to the city. So we'll be paying debt on that for 20 to 30 years, but we take out about 15 million a year to pay for, specifically for transportation related capital projects. And then in fiscal 21, we had kind of an anomaly. We had a short-term loan for some BCIT projects, some very important kind of information technology infrastructure. So these fund sources are really important because while the capital budget is fairly large, 600 million last year, I think, a lot of the money is very specifically dedicated to specific projects, like the 3/4 that has to go to the utilities. The state and federal funds, typically, they're either for a very specific project or a specific purpose. And so these remaining sources are what we really have to use to both match state and federal funds and to fund all the city's priorities for which there's no other fund source. So this is what we spend most of our time looking at and making decisions about. And this is how those fund sources have fluctuated over time. When the city has a surplus or in a good year, they might put more pay-go towards capital projects to try to, tackle some of our infrastructure needs. But in a bad year, they might not be able to put any. So that kind of is part of the reason why that fluctuates. And then this is how those 5 fund sources broke down across agencies. So transportation, including the MDOT bonds in here, they got 23 million, almost 24 million. Housing and community development is the next largest, then the school system, and then some of these others, DGS, Rec and Parks, Information Technology, Solid Waste, Baltimore Development Corps, and Mayoralty and Planning. Hopefully you all voted, last month or earlier this month. It's hard to keep up with what day it is anymore and how long ago that was. But if you did vote, hopefully you voted on the Geo Bonds. They all passed, but you see this on the ballot. In order to issue Geo Bonds, cities usually have to go, or in Baltimore is no exception, Baltimore has to ask the voters for authorization to take on that debt. And that's basically because if the city were to be unable to pay that debt, the city's agreeing to use its taxing authority to repay the debt. But typically these are a very safe investment. There's very low risk that the city would ever default. But also I think this is important because the loan authorization does kind of break down how those general obligation bonds have to be used. So you would have voted on $12 million for affordable housing across 2 years, $38 million for community and economic development, $72 million for rec and parks and public facilities, or I think it was called public infrastructure this time, and then $38 million for schools. So that does guide. We have to respect those boundaries of the loan authorization in making decisions about the Geo Bond. And then this is just kind of my downer slide to say that we know that there are a lot of infrastructure needs in the city, and we let agencies request a little more than they're going to get, but we know that their needs are vastly larger than even what they're requesting. So there are a lot of things that you might know need to be done that you won't even see as an agency request because they have to even whittle it down as to what they request. So I have just a few slides about equity, which we've been trying to look at and figure out how to measure and assess and improve the equitable distribution of funds over the last three or so years. So the city has an equity definition from the Equity Assessment Program, which is legislation that was passed, I think in 2018. And it states that equity means closing the gaps in policy practice and allocation of resources so that race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and income do not predict one's success while also improving outcomes for all. And the Baltimore Planning Department has its own equity definition, saying that an equitable Baltimore addresses the needs and aspirations of its diverse population and meaningfully engages residents through inclusive and collaborative processes to expand access to power and resources. Oh, mouthfuls. And so we kind of had a staff effort starting in 2015 to look at planning's role in in creating inequity in our city and think about what we need to do to reverse some of those trends. And so one of the key recommended actions was to analyze the capital budget. And so I'm going to talk about the analysis that we've done now, but I do want to just put it in context and say that the capital budget, we're only looking at the capital budget, which is kind of one form of investment in the city. There's also private investment, federal and state programs, philanthropic investment, and then, you know, we make investments through the operating budget. So we're just focusing kind of narrowly on that capital budget piece. The first thing to know is that we did this by looking at where the money was allocated, where the projects were located, what neighborhood they were in, when we could. But only about half of the dollars that we budget in the capital budget have we been able to map to a specific location. A lot of funds are requested and budgeted for things like resurfacing, which doesn't have a specific location when we make the budget decision. And so that's been one of our key areas of focus this year, is to try to get better location information. But of the location information that we did have, this is where the funds went. So we look at it on 3-year rolling cycles. We look at the per capita allocation by neighborhood, and we're using the 56 broad community statistical areas that the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance uses, recognizing that most people, when they think about their neighborhood, they're not thinking about these areas, they're thinking about a more specific geographic area, but we roll it up just to kind of give us better data. If we used the 300 neighborhoods, there would be a lot of neighborhoods that just didn't have anything, frankly. And so the darker areas are areas that had higher allocations in the FY19, 20, and 21 capital budgets. And so we take that and then we look at the demographics of those neighborhoods. And we break the neighborhoods into 4 quartiles based on those demographics. So we look at the approximately, I think, 13 neighborhoods with the highest percent of Black or African American residents, and then the next quarter of neighborhoods, and the next quarter, and then the gray bar here at the bottom represents the quarter of neighborhoods with the lowest percent of Black or African American residents. And we're trying to just compare, are we allocating more to the neighborhoods with more Black or African American residents, or less than? If all things were equal, each of these chunks of blue would approximately be at the lines here. And so you can see in FY 14 to 16, the neighborhoods with fewer Black or African American residents got more than you would have expected if all things were equal. Things look a little better in these middle years, and then in the most recent year, set of 3 years, things didn't look that good again. And then we also look at it by income. So kind of similarly, if all things were equal, you would expect, and sorry, this top bar is the quarter of neighborhoods with the highest median household income. And this dark black bar here is the households with the lowest median income, the quarter of neighborhoods with the lowest median household income. Kind of a lot to wrap your mind around, but hopefully the visuals help understand it. But what this kind of tells us is that the middle income neighborhoods are getting more than you would expect if all things were equal. And so that's how we've been looking at it. We've been looking at it this way for about 3 years now. We typically look back at what we've done after the recommendations are made, and kind of realized after we saw this pattern in the most recent year, we said, oh, we need to look at this sooner and understand why that looks like that, because it doesn't look equitable. It doesn't look equal if not equitable. And so one of the immediate next steps, and one thing we're doing this year, is to conduct that analysis earlier, as soon as we get the agency requests, so that we have a little more time to understand and react if things do not look to be moving in a direction that we want to go. And then we're also working with agencies to require additional location information wherever they can provide it. In the long term, though, we are looking to establish an oversight committee to provide input into project selection, and that may include revising our evaluation criteria, providing more active review of utility funded projects. As I noted, DPW utilities are about 75% of the budget, anywhere from 2/3 to 75% in any given year. And so where those projects are located really tends to drive a lot of what we see in the patterns in this analysis. So we might also take the utility projects out and look at it with and without the utility projects to see what it looks like. And then we have a few other kind of long-term next steps about engaging with the community to understand how different projects affect neighborhoods differently, looking at best practices from other cities and that sort of thing. And so that is the end of my presentation. And I would be happy to take questions.
There was a question in the chat about how we can access the data on equity, and I went ahead and put in the link to the planning department section on it, but I don't know if you might want to just tell people a little bit about like the map or, you know, the other resources that are on there.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yep, we do have a website. And so in 2019, I think, we worked with the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. We had done this in 2018 internally and with a fellow from Morgan State. And then the next year we asked BNU to kind of come in and like help us polish it. And so they kind of put together a big report that really explains the methodology and how it's done and the background. So that BNU report is on there. We updated the equity analysis for fiscal 20. And so the update is on there. Also, that equity assessment program legislation requires us to report to council each year on this. And so that report is included on the website. And then there's a map, an interactive map, which shows all of the projects. You can click in and like click on a specific project and see how much was allocated. If you are looking to do some analysis yourself, though, I do want to point you to, we have another link on the same website, but like if you go to the sidebar, there should be a link to reports and resources. So we have shape files with the projects, and it should include the total amount and the year and that sort of thing. So we have shape files from each year with the projects and Excel sheets and PDF reports. And actually on that same website, you can go back and look at old planning commission presentations and things like that. So I hope, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. And if you do any analysis, please let us know. I would love to know that somebody's using those Excel sheets or shape files and what you find, and that'd be great.
I'll have to dust off my GIS a little bit.
All right.
So we got another question in the chat here. Is there any part of this process that incentivizes or allows for agencies to submit requests for comprehensive projects that address the needs or goals of multiple agencies? Or could this be considered in the update of the evaluation criteria?
Yeah, that's a good question. Agencies can submit requests for whatever they choose, whatever they think is necessary. So there would be nothing to preclude them from submitting a request for a comprehensive project right now. And I do think that will be reflected in the update of the evaluation criteria, because we know that, especially with these physical infrastructure projects, We can do things much cheaper if we coordinate. If we, if we know we're going to have to dig up the road to address the water line, and we wait to resurface the road until after we've done that. So we will. I would hope, I would anticipate giving some credit for projects that do that. But Megan, if you have any examples of projects, like something that you're thinking, I'd be really interested in hearing kind of what you're thinking about there.
This is something too that I think the Complete Streets Ordinance that was passed will help with. There's basically like a coordinating council of agency heads that are required to review like major infrastructure projects as part of that ordinance. So, sometimes the agencies don't play nice with one another, but this will like legislatively mandate it. So there's like a whole project spreadsheet they need to go through and sort of demonstrate that they've checked these boxes off. So if you did have like a major streetscaping project, there would be forced coordination with like DPW, for example. Or if you were trying to build, the entire Greenway Trail network, it might be good to like partner that alongside, some rec center improvements or playground improvements that might be along that trail. So you're sort of providing those things both at the same time.
Have there been other examples of that happening before Complete Streets? Or is that like one of the first efforts that has been an overseeing of all the different agencies making decisions together in that way?
Is that for me or Jed? I'm sorry.
I mean, I guess for you, unless Jed knows the answer.
Yeah, no, there are several ways that they're supposed to coordinate now. I think they have tools, particularly the ones that work on horizontal assets. They have tools to help coordinate like the timing and location of when they're doing work, especially along the right of way. But they're kind of only as good as the data that they get in. So I think things do get missed just through the operation of bureaucracy.
We have another question in the chat about asking, are there any efforts to make the public input process more equitable, such as access to public meetings, alternative ways to provide input, et cetera, in addition to thinking about equitable investment?
Yeah, we've been trying to think about that. So we, and of course, COVID has thrown a wrench in a lot of things, this being one of them. But starting in 2018, we started to host 2 just public information sessions about the capital budget a year, and making sure that we go into the community instead of having people come downtown to the planning department across the street from City Hall. And so we started in Berea on the east side, and did Sandtown and Cherry Hill, and I can't remember, Cherry Hill might have been the last one we did. So that's kind of been how we've been attacking that, but it's still obviously a challenge to ask people to come out on a weeknight at 6 o'clock when maybe they need to get their kids dinner and listen to a presentation about the CIP, which may or may not actually affect their lives. So so I think that's always a challenge. And then, we are looking to make some changes to our process, and we will need public input. So we have to think about how we do that, especially in COVID times. We don't want only people who are digitally savvy and able to get on meetings like this to be providing input. So, so yeah, it's something we think about, but certainly haven't figured out. So welcome your thoughts and feedback about any successful efforts that you've seen.
Yes, I'll ask you a question just in case any other people are thinking of theirs still. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, you sort of mentioned the city plans, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how like neighborhood plans or like community organizations that have been advocating for improvements in their neighborhood sort of formalize those requests, and how that is sort of like a guiding process to get into the CIP, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so So all of the requests do originate with city agencies. So at times they are looking to their plans to determine what projects they're requesting. And then our planners, if they've worked on neighborhood plans or area plans, will certainly work with us to tell us, listen, we have this plan, this specific project has been in this plan for 5 years. We'd like to see DOT or Rec and Parks requested in their CIP request. And so we'll talk to DOT and say, why is it in there? Why is it not in there? That sort of thing. So it's a good entry point to get a project on the record. But I will say it's certainly not a guarantee that a project is going to get funded. We probably have, I'm certain that we have far more projects identified in plans than we would ever be able to fund. So it's not an automatic guarantee. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I think one of the other challenges that this sort of goes back to our little exercise with putting the coins in the bucket at the beginning. A lot of the stuff that needs to happen just isn't really exciting stuff, right? So for example, DOT, like we want to build all our new bike lanes, we want to build the Greenway Trail Network, we want expanded transit, we want all these things, but they're also facing like a $1 billion essentially shortfall. Like they have deferred maintenance approaching $1 billion. So that's like 186 million a year for the next 20 years that they don't really have the capacity to, like, we're not giving them that much money every year. So they're not able to really make up that shortfall. So they have to really carefully choose the projects that they are, doing going forward. And that is why we really need to advocate, because sometimes agencies might not make decisions that we, as Baltimore or as other neighbors think might be, sort of the best decision or the best bang for that buck. So, that's why we testify at the Planning Commission hearing, for this budget, and, encourage other people to do so as well.
Yeah, and to that end, the projects that I love the most, because they make my life a little bit easier, are the projects where we're both fixing a current piece of infrastructure that needs to be fixed, but also adding, updating it to kind of modern standards and better serve. So I feel like new striping for, I'm like out of my wheelhouse now, but new striping for a bike lane when you're resurfacing or rebuilding the road anyway, that to me feels like the sweet spot.
Yeah, we have a question from Carly in the chat, and is the breakdown data that you presented on race and income used for anything besides simple data collection? Does it inform future budget planning? And are there trends in why certain years have more or less in certain areas?
Yeah, so the trends about why certain years have more or less in certain areas, the digging that we've done and kind of what we think is driving those trends are a lot of the big infrastructure projects. So you guys probably know the water tanks being built in Druid Hill Park at the lake. They're being buried and put underground. So that was a massive project, and a lot of budget allocations in some of the years, where I think some of the years, but projects like that do seem to be driving the trends. Or there's, a water main replacement project because the water pipes are incredibly old in a certain neighborhood. So those amounts really just sort of far outweigh the parks and the bike lanes and the even the fire stations or demolition. They just sort of, the scale is so different from those other types of investment that it really does sort of drive the trends. And that's one reason we think we need to separate out DPW utilities from the rest of the capital budget. And probably, look at things through a finer grained lens. And then, is it used for anything besides simple data collection? To date, we've been using it to look back and to see how we did. But this year we do hope to look at it early and use it to inform where, where projects are going that we're making decisions about. It'll be interesting to try to do that if we, we don't, usually the utilities are reacting to where things are either breaking down or the oldest parts of the system. And so we're not necessarily shifting funds around within the utilities. They have a pretty sophisticated model for where they're spending money, although they are internally revamping that model and their process to include a much more detailed look at equity and building it into each kind of evaluation criteria that they use. But so yes, we do hope to use it to inform future budget planning, but we still have to get to finer grained detail to see how to do that.
I also think it's important to sort of try to tackle this equity issue even earlier, like when the projects are even being developed to submit to, the department. So again, back to the Complete Streets Ordinance, one of the really exciting things there is it's really equity focused even for their project selection criteria. So for example, right now with paving and resurfacing, it's kind of a black box on how it happens, but roughly they look at the city's pavement index, which is like the quality of pavement on roads, and then they divide it up amongst the 14 council districts and tell the council people pick a couple, and we're going to resurface in every district. And that's just, it makes everyone happy, but it's not equitable. So the new process will focus primarily on equity, where are we putting this stuff? Are we going to prioritize majority Black neighborhoods for paving? We'll still look at the pavement condition index, but we'll also look at actual traffic safety. So is this resurfacing an opportunity to put in bump outs or new high visibility crosswalks or things like that? And those will get ranked within the department much higher than just sort of the prior system. And then those will go forward into this proposed CIP. So hopefully there would be, more significant ranking and project selection even prior to the submission. And that's something that I think Mayor-elect Scott's sort of equity legislation citywide is aiming at. And a lot of the other agencies might not have come up with that level of detail or granularity on project selection, but hopefully this Complete Streets stuff can sort of be a lesson that they can start to apply in other agencies too.
Yeah, that I think the equity legislation will start to, we've already seen agencies start to think about it more and reference it and talk about it, but it will start to require them to build it into their processes more and more. So that's a really good point.
Maybe we can do this last question from Elam and then start wrapping up. And his question is, how could capital improvement advocacy at the city level potentially influence an infrastructure project like the Red Line? And what determines if a project is spearheaded by the state instead of the city? Maybe that's a good Jed and Kristen answer.
Yeah. You probably know better than me for transportation projects what is spearheaded by the state instead of the city. I mean, the state and the federal dollars do, because the dollars are so significant, they do, I think, drive a lot of what we do. We're required to do bridges with a lot of our federal money and that sort of thing. And then the state has to approve some of our plans for big infrastructure fixes. But the Red Line, yeah, that wasn't a city. I think I don't know that advocacy towards city agencies or council people would have influenced that. I think everybody wanted it, may it rest in peace. But I know there are groups that are in the city that are working to advocate at the federal and state levels, and including, groups that are looking at regional transportation authorities and things like that that may, be able to influence.
Yeah, I think that's, so the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance had just commissioned a study from ENO on like creation of a regional transit authority. So that's like similar to Washington. They have WMATA, which is like the Metropolitan Transit Authority down there. Or in Boston, they have like MBTA. These are like regional governance structures that allow essentially like a board and multiple jurisdictions to do transit planning and allocate the transit funding. MTA is just a state agency right now, so it's basically accountable to the governor. And that's how you get into a situation where you have transit planning for the Red Line under, you know, 2 Democrats and a Republican, and then all of a sudden another Republican just cancels it, and there isn't really any recourse. I think Kristen's right that with like the Red Line, probably advocacy at the city level couldn't have really helped. I think as we're looking at like quick implementation, rapid transit improvements, things we could do like overnight in the city, even though we don't control the MTA and we don't really get to say where the buses go or how frequently they come or any of that stuff, we do control our streets. So the city could invest in infrastructure like, you know, painted bus lanes or the, you know, TSP, which is the transit signal prioritization in our traffic signals that lets the buses get a green light when they come up to the light. So like investments like that, which the city has done on some projects and made an investment there on some projects, like we can improve the transit system we have now using city dollars or directly applying for federal grants that maybe Governor Hogan won't apply for or won't instruct the MTA to apply for. So there are ways we can help out, and there, you know, and all of our city elected officials and agencies can be partners in that.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen, and thank you, Jed. And I guess we can wrap up now. If anyone has other questions, is it okay if they reach out to you, Kristen?
Yeah, should I put my contact info in the chat? I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds great. And you can also reach out to me or Jed, probably Jed, because I know way less than he does. But thank you all for coming tonight. And yeah, we will send out the recording of this if you want to reference it or send it to a friend. And appreciate it. Have a good Thursday night.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.
Bye.